Today I'm going to be showing a nice project if you're just starting to get into cutting dovetails by hand. It's a really simple project, only involves 2 joints, so if you're wanting to give it a try, I think you'll enjoy this. It's also a really handy thing to have in your kitchen, so let's go ahead and dive into the video. So I recently decided that I needed a better spot to keep some of the cutting boards in my kitchen, and so I came up with this quick design that's going to actually mount underneath one of the hanging cabinets in the kitchen and just allow for easy accessibility to cutting boards and getting them off the countertop. So I'm going to be making this out of cherry, and this is going to be a really good project for somebody that might be wanting to get into doing some hand cut dovetails. The reason is that this is only going to consist of 2 dovetail joints, and so you don't have to have the pressure of, getting 4 perfect corners if you were putting together like a box or a carcass for a cabinet or something like that. So I start off by just cutting the cherry to its proper dimensions, getting it milled down to thickness, and getting the edges planed flat. Again, I like to use a hand plane before running things through the table saw just because I'm able to get a perfectly flat edge. You can see I put a reference line with the pencil there and then just take it off in one shaving. So one of the things that is definitely important, whether you're cutting dovetails or any kind of joinery, is just to make accurate layout lines with a marking knife. And the best way to do this is a good accurate rule and a marking knife, and to line that directly with the tooth of your table saw blade when you're making these cuts. And I use a stop block just to make sure any parts that need to be equal actually come out to the exact same dimension. So now I can get started on just laying out the dovetails. So I use my marking gauge to go ahead and add the thickness dimension to the pin and tail boards. And then I use this little 3D printed gauge I have just to do some 8:1 ratio dovetails. And as always, I mark out the waist just to make sure I don't actually cut into the wrong portion of the joint. So you can see here I'm doing some fairly thin pins just because I like the aesthetic that it gives these joints when you do them. It just lets you know that they're hand cut and just gives a little higher level of craftsmanship to them. But of course it also makes you need to cut even very more accurate because there's really no room for error. As you can see, those are super narrow pins there in the waist. And after cutting the tails and then transferring and cutting the pins, I use the fret saw to just take care of the waist. And this is a little trick I always do when I'm cutting off the side pins from the tailboard, is that I actually use the chisel just to give myself a tiny little shoulder to line up with the saw. That's just going to make sure I don't go past that shoulder line, as that will end up in an immediate gap in the final joint. And then you can use the shoulder to reference your saw and just get a nice plumb cut. It's always satisfying cutting out these tiny little pins because they just pop out with a few strokes of the fret saw. Now before chiseling out the remaining waste, I go ahead and give my chisels a quick sharpen. I follow Rob Cosman's sharpening method, which is starting at a 1000 grit diamond stone just to do a secondary bevel, and then doing a very small tertiary bevel with the 16,000 grit Shafton stone. And I find that this gives me a very good edge, and I have found that just this works for me. So when chiseling out the waist of your dovetails, it's important to work your way to the actual shoulder line, because if you go straight to it, you're going to end up wedging and pushing back past the shoulder line. And so you want to go about halfway in from each side so that you don't blow through the opposing side as well. And when you do that, you'll be left in just clearing out some of the waste that is left over. I think that chiseling out the pin boards is definitely a little more challenging because you have to account for those angles as you chisel downward. With a little practice, you'll get pretty good at it, and you can see here you get perfect shoulder lines. Finally, before assembling the joint, I like to make sure that there's no high spots in the waist that I removed, because if there is, that's not going to allow the boards to seat fully or the joint to seat fully, and so if there is, I just pare it away, any high spots, and then double check it again. Now this cutting board tray is just going to have two little sliding shelves that slide out and allow you to put any cutting boards on top of it. And so as with most dovetail joints, you have to do a stopped dado in order to house this sort of a panel. And that way you don't blow out through the joint and end up creating a gap again. And so I just carefully do these stopped dados on the router table, or stopped grooves in this case, and it works out pretty well as long as you do it slow and controlled. I like to just ease the edges before assembly, especially the inside edges, because they're going to be hard to get to later. And then I go ahead and pre-finish the interior faces with some Odie's oil, just to get that over with now. So assembly is pretty straightforward, especially when there's only two joints, but you do have to make sure that you get a good amount of glue applied and that you get a good clamping block so that you're applying pressure into the joint and not letting the pins or the tail side kind of obstruct the clamp. So I make little sacrificial clamps that I use. And then I just get rid of any glue squeeze out and check the final assembly for square before tightening down and leaving it to dry. Once it's completely cured there, I can go ahead and clean up the faces and the edges to get them flushed up. And this just takes a few swipes with the hand plane. So next I'll do the couple sliding panels. Now ideally I would have done this out of just solid hardwood, but I didn't really have any narrow enough or wide enough stock to kind of glue up these panels, so I just went with some cherry plywood, 1/4 inch plywood that I already had on hand, and I'll end up putting a little bit of hardwood on the edge banding the front edge, just to, get rid of that unpleasant plywood edge. So I ripped down some cherry really thin to be that edge banding, and I use 2 sacrificial blocks with some cork on it, and that just allows me to get a little zero clearance push block on the table saw. And then I can just go ahead and glue that on and use some painter's tape to get that clamped down. Using the hand plane makes quick work of flushing that up with the panel, but you have to be really careful that you don't plane into the plywood, as you can quickly plane past that top veneer sheet and reveal the, less desirable inside panels of the plywood. And I was probably a little more accurate than you need to be on this, but I just pre-drilled for some mounting holes, and these are what will actually attach this thing to the kitchen cabinet. That way I don't have to deal with it when it's up and holding onto it against the cabinet. Then I can come through and give it one final sanding just to clean up all the edges. So you can see here it's a relatively simple build, but it does give you a good chance to put your hand-cut dovetails some practice and put them to the test in trying to get an assembly put together. And so it's a really good little project if you're just looking for a quick organization thing. And as you'll see in the final picture, it actually turns out looking quite elegant in the kitchen. And I use the router in this case just to put a little 1/2 inch hole in the underside of the panel to put my emblem. With all that done, I can put on a coat of Odie's oil, and the Odie's oil is just a nice natural finish. It has a really nice smell, and it's just really easy to apply, which is one of the main reasons I like using it. and I just put one coat on the entire build. Here you can get a nice satisfying snap fit, so it really got the dimensions right on this one, which is good. And using those pre-drilled holes, I just go ahead and screw it into the frame of the cabinet. So this is a really nice organizational project, and it looks pretty elegant in your kitchen, especially if you make it out of a nice hardwood. So hopefully you enjoyed this quick and easy project, guys. If you did, go ahead and give the video a like. Be sure to subscribe, help my channel grow. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.